VCT Stage 1 kicks off in just under a week, but on the heels of patch 12.05 where both Sky and Yoru saw pretty significant changes, this meta is anything but solved. In this video I want to go over the core characteristics of the meta that teams are going to have to consider, as well as my solutions for it. Let's jump right in. Hello everyone, my name is Martin Anders Shalazine, coach and strategist you might recognize from my time on teams like Fnatic and G2, where I contributed to multiple title wins. Before we jump into the conversation about specifically the Stage 1 meta, I wanted to frame it up a little bit and talk about, at an abstract level, what a multi-layered meta is, as that's what we're going into. Jargon aside, you're probably already somewhat familiar with this concept. You've probably heard on broadcasts from people like Sideshow and Mini talking about whether teams are going to play the meta or play an anti-meta composition. In most metagame-driven strategy genres, these would be referred to as the layers of the meta. The first layer of the meta is typically going to be the best thing that you can be doing in a vacuum, the thing that's most pushed by the current balance of the game. The second layer is going to be the thing that beats that, even if it doesn't necessarily have the same level of power across the entire board. And in rare cases, you get a third layer to a meta, which is what counters the counter. This is typically exceedingly rare stuff that you only really see in hyper-mature metagames or extremely balanced game states. If we look back at last year, we can actually see a lot of these concepts in action. Stage 2 of 2025, as well as Champions Paris, had a lot of the hallmarks of a 3-layer meta, and I think that's a big contributor to why people are now looking back on that fondly as potentially one of the most balanced eras of the game's history. Double Controller's standard established itself as the best-in-slot first layer on most maps during Toronto, with Paper Rex melding that with Double Duelist to help win the Double Controller mirror and ultimately winning the trophy. In the following stage, multiple teams quickly iterated on that and stuck with the Double Duelist evolution from Paper Rex to try to replicate their predation on Viper comps. At the same time, albeit way less widespread, on maps where Double Initiator was the standard, we also saw teams experimenting with Double Senti. By the time Paris rolled around, both first and second layers of the meta were actively seeing widespread play, and it opened the door for a true triangular meta. Essentially, every archetype had something it could prey on somewhere in the event. Now, the reason I explain all of that is we're essentially back at square zero. Coming out of Santiago, there's no consensus on even what the first layer of this meta is. The benchmark set by Nongshim would imply that we should be going Double Duelist Neon Yoru, but we have patch 12.05 to reconcile that with. Should teams be dropping Yoru after his heavy nerfs and jumping on Sky's flash buff? If they do, what goes with that Sky? A second Initiator, some combination of Waylay, Raze, Neon Double Dive, a Phoenix for flash redundancy, or do we just stick it out with Yoru? My personal expectation for the first layer of this meta is a lot of standard Double Controller, the tried and true on the maps where it makes sense, as well as a lot of Sky Double Dive or Skydive. Witty, I know. There is a wrinkle to getting on top of this first layer though. Standard Double Controller wants us to play Double Duelist to overwhelm the Viper entrenchment, but it also wants us to stay on Yoru to have an adequate counter for Vice Walls. Sky Double Dive, on the other hand, wants us to play standard Double Initiator since it's dropped its answer for Vice Entrenchment and doesn't have the util volume to trade into Double Initiator if stalled. So what do we do? And the simple answer is, we have to dive in map by map. But, if you want to dive in map by map in a different way, you can do that with my Patreon. On my Patreon, I post map-by-map agent and premier team comp tier lists for every major patch, as well as premier-focused playbooks, and while not working with teams, this is my primary source of income, so your support is greatly appreciated. That said, let's get into Bind. At Layer 1, we have Skydive. Bind is a top 2 map for Sky, and I expect there's going to be a reactionary shift away from Yoru and onto Neon. All the factors really point towards this being the easy first layer that a lot of teams will go towards. On to Layer 2, and it's none other than classic Bind Double Initiator. Play the util tax game, forcing the Skydive comps to burn their thin util budgets on pre-exec space, and you've opened a game plan angle for floods and hardholds. So this is where things get interesting. We have an ambiguous 2-layer meta. We're going to expect both of these comps being played relatively widely, but they have very different demands from you in terms of how to counter them. So what's our solve? In the first example of what will be a lot of this, we're going to shift over to a classic Senti Double Controller comp with Vice, Astra, Viper, Raze, Fade. Teams widely dropping their Yours means their answers to Vice Wall are going to be extremely limited and prohibitively costly. You're not going to see a lot of teams willing to spend the majority of their Waylay kit just to clear these Vice Walls, which means your entrenchment value goes through the roof. If we play walls inset from bottlenecks, we create a situation where our opponent is either required to commit fully past that wall on initial exec, or they have to burn all of that Waylay utility as a first step before their exec, making them extremely soft to fast floods or a set retake. Given that's something that we now have to expect, especially as the better teams start implementing it widely, we need access to a pivot that can beat it. That puts us on what might feel like a little bit of a dated Yoru Raze comp, but in the context of it being there to counter a surge in Vice play rate, it makes complete sense. And we're on the Raze over something like a Waylay or a Neon, because with Yoru losing that flash, we need access to Boombot to help us consolidate some extremity space towards showers or towards long, having that extra little info cycle to help keep our util budget stable. Moving on to Breeze, it's a little bit of an interesting one, because I think it's the map in the pool where we're least likely to see a widespread dropping of Yorus. We've seen a lot of shift in the past over to flash initiators like KO and Sky, and they've consistently been outperformed by single initiator recon alternatives, so I think people have mostly caught on to the fact that those are going to underperform in direct head-to-heads. That does leave us in a sticky situation still. On layer 1, we will have that straightforward double duelist, double controller Sova that's been a staple on the map since its return. But on layer 2, as much as I do believe rumors of Yoru's demise have been greatly exaggerated, I expect Breeze's outsized importance on the op to really highlight his TP nerf. Him no longer being able to statically hold space opens the gate for Chamber, Veto, and even potentially Cypher to slide back into the meta. Pick and leave style defenses with Sentis who aren't as focused on playing as sunk costs on site, they get their +1 and just stage you for a really great retake. Those are going to be the best fit solutions versus double duelists on maps like Breeze, where there is an absence of easily contestable extremities, and there aren't really a ton of easily trappable bottlenecks. For our solution, I'll admit, we're going a bit off the rails. Breeze is a notoriously form-driven map, and so I'm a lot less concerned with presenting a perfectly optimized macro solution, and a lot more concerned with presenting my opponent with novel util sets and really challenging questions that they have to answer. And to achieve that, I've gone for a second layer comp, but with a Harbor for Viper swap, and a Phoenix over Yoru. The Phoenix alongside Neon gives us slice redundancy to cover potential smoke cycling issues that we could hit without our Viper, and the impending threat of Phoenix ult shifts the baseline defensive assumptions for our opponents. They now need to be far more proactive in trying to deny us the A main orb farm. This comp presents enough novelty that it should be able to ride out the entire stage, if not all the way through London if things go well. But we also need a backup plan. So being able to shift back onto a classic double controller double duelist while staying within comfortable roles if we need them is the perfect emergency exit. Fractures Layer 1 is going to be a bit of an open season. The map's being freshly reintroduced, and the majority of the staples on it have seen some sort of balance touch since the last time it was in. But there is a sort of tried and true safe option here, which is in new metas, when in doubt, just play aggressively. Go as aggro as you can, ask as many questions as you can, and that will typically be your best fit solve in the absence of anything better. Because of that, I think we're going to see a lot more of that double dive here. We're going to see Waylay Neon, we're going to see Waylay Raze, and we're going to see it backed up by a lot of the common culprits. Breach, Brim, Cypher. Until it's proven that those don't work, I think that's where people will go. Coincidentally, the answer to that is a return to old solutions. Layer 2 will go to double initiator Vice with some flexibility in its dive duelist choice. Neon, Waylay, or Raze would all have their pros and cons without changing the comp's overall identity. Put these two together and our answer has to have a lot of dynamism. A baseline comp with Phoenix Raze double duelist gives us great ult snowballing and duelists who are each independently capable of opening on one of Fracture's 4 corridors. Fade and Astra give us a util volume that can contend with double initiator util trades, but still give us enough for real execs. To round it out, we have a flexible Sentinel slot. Chamber gives us a P&L defense option, and Vice gives us strong anti-dive. Veto gets an extremely strong honorable mention here, but in the interest of keeping agent pools tight for our hypothetical players, I don't want to add a 1 of Veto, especially on a map where Vice will be best fit the lion's share amount of the time anyways. Coincidentally, because of that expected Vice power level, we need to hold open the Yoru option for ourselves, and to round out our options, we also want access to a fire alarm for fringe Senti picks. I'm talking about things like, what if we hit Rogue KJs and we don't have an answer to the ultimate because we don't have a breach? We'd bring an answer by either trading Brimstone ultimate for it or leaning into Teo missiles. And what if we hit a chamber ourselves? Well, we want an insulation against chamber ops, so we bring that hard info drone from the Teo as well. Fracture ends up being the map with our most moving parts, but it also ends up being the one that's the easiest to trim the fat. Depending on how flexible teams do end up being with their Senti picks, we can carve out a lot of these options, and it keeps the map very lean in terms of the demands it puts on the players. Moving over to Haven, it'll be one of the simpler maps in the pool. Even with the balance patch, the archetypes that make up the meta layers shouldn't change that significantly. At layer 1, we have Gen G style classic Viper comps, and at layer 2, we have Paper Rex inspired Double Duelist. Unfortunately for us, that simplicity is also kind of deceiving. The fact that it has such clearly defined first and second layers means that we actually need a 3-comp solution ourselves in order to deal with everything this map could be throwing at us. To beat the Viper comps at layer 1, we have Double Duelist, but with Yoru to insulate against Vice variants. At layer 2, we mirror the Double Duelist, and versus Skydive or Rogue Double Initiator comps, we revert to standard Vice Viper. If you throw back to the intro, I was talking about highly matured metas going to true triangular dynamics, and this is a great example of that at work. Even if we do have balance changes, Haven is so fleshed out as a map that we still end up with that coming through. Lotus follows a lot of the same patterns of Haven. The first layer is a familiar face, the archetype I started back with Fnatic, just updated with Vice and Neon. The second layer is a shift to Double Duelist Yoru to push pace and have an onboard answer to Vice Entrenchment. And our solve is simply going to be to just mirror those two solutions. We trade in our Neon for Raze to keep our util volume stable despite losing a Yoru flash, but other than that, same old, same old. Pearl is probably the single hardest map to read in the pool because it's the one that's going to be the most affected by the Yoru nerfs. Yoru no longer being able to consolidate extremities or hold forward lines due to the reduction in his TP time is going to be extremely obvious, and a lot of teams, it's going to fundamentally change the way that they have to play the map. As a result, I expect the first layer to shift to Double Initiator with a Senti slot juggled between Chamber, Killjoy, and Vice. As for the initiators, I see a lot of teams either falling into old habits and running KO Sova, or following in G2's and NRG's footsteps and running Teo Sova Double Drone. That means that the second layer is also something a lot of people will be familiar with. We can go back into meta history and say, well, what ended up beating all of the Double Initiator comps when people were running them back in the day? And that's Viper comps. The widespread cutting of Yoru is going to make Vice Viper in particular a major contender. In fact, I expect that comp to be so strong that our solve is to simply run it ourselves. I think that we have to have a pivot that focuses on trying to maybe beat it, which puts us back over onto Yoru Neon, but there's definitely a timeline where we start cracking this out, the meta starts hashing out, and simply running the Viper comp mirrors is the best fit solution. Last but not least, we get to an easy one. It's going to be Split. Split is begging for people to play Skydive on it, and I expect a lot of teams to oblige. That makes our second layer a much more classic Split with Vice to punish that dive. Our comps take the same classic Split, adding a simple swap to Yoru to answer the mirror. And that rounds out our map pool. There's definitely some places here where you could get more edge, don't get me wrong. We could potentially try to slot in Veto on Fracture and Lotus. We could potentially look at having a Chamber Vice pivot on Lotus or Pearl. But there is something underlying here that you may or may not have noticed. At the end of the day, I'm still a coach. I care as much about the realities of implementing this as I do the theoretical underpinnings. And so we've held every single player in our team to a maximum of 4 agents. If we wanted to call the herd even more, we could bin the innovation from Breeze, accept some matchup risk on Fracture, and we can get those down to absurdly refined roles. Now, if that's better or worse for our chances of winning would be a team-by-team discussion, but there was conscious effort in making this pool not only highly meta-aware, but also easy to put into action. The main takeaways from this, other than the literal list of comps, is that the nerfs to Yoru are significantly less impactful than people are making them out to be. He still occupies a fundamentally unique niche in the game in that he can self-capitalize off of catalytic util that he has in his own kit. He still has a flash. He can push forward extremity space and then be untradeable out of that space while also having rotational acceleration as part of his escape mechanism. Nobody else in the game does that. All he's lost is his ability to consolidate that forward space. The way Yoru is going to be played now is not, I take this space, and then I get to sit in it for 30 seconds. It's, I take this space, I cheat my rotate with my teleport, and because I have teammates, they consolidate the space behind me. That's the only change we've seen with the agent. He is still incredibly powerful, and him being the best fit answer to Vice is going to make sure that he still has an extremely important spot in this meta. And following on to that, one of the other important takeaways is that Vice is going to be insane. She was already wildly underrated through kickoffs and Santiago, and it's only going to become even more so the case as people lean heavily into Neon off of the heels of Dombi and start dropping their Yorus in overreaction. This agent could be the single greatest defining force in terms of how we see the rules of engagement in the coming meta. And I don't say that lightly. There is definitely an asterisk. I'm not talking about the Vice that we've seen in many circumstances preceding now. I'm not talking about I put my wall in the bottleneck, I put a thorn right behind it, haha, got him. That's not going to get the job done. I'm talking about in-set Vice walls that your opponent has to proceed multiple body lengths into sight in order to bait out. They're going to be forced to use that waylay dash to get it if they don't have a Yoru. Their Yoru clone might not even get it consistently itself. And then you have staggered thorns. There's one of them near the wall. There's one of them in the common dive end location for the waylay dive route or the Neon's pathing. You're not going to have a situation where your Vice puts standard utility down in the bottleneck and does anything impactful. But if you run true anti-dive Vice setups, it is going to reach a level of power that will flat lock teams out. Now, only time will tell if these comps would be anywhere near as successful as I think they'd be, or if my meta predictions are anywhere on target, but the good news is, we can find out together. I'll be streaming VCT, EMEA, and Americas starting April 1st, where the only fools will be the people not in my chat. Jokes aside, I appreciate the people who have stuck it out. This is definitely the longest video I've done in quite a while, but that's all for me. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.